The beautiful community. Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. And we're going to do an interesting chat today because today's the 1.5 year anniversary since I last stood up, even for a second. So I'm going to take questions either about my health or about your health or about your thoughts about any transferable bits of learning or development or inspiration that can be extrapolated from my health experience. So, are you ready to rock and roll, beautiful community? I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Amalfitano, thank you for seeing and hearing. So, let's take a question. Dane of the Hill. For me, it's been 4.5 years with long COVID, and it's eaten a huge hole in my life. I mostly just keep going. Could you talk about how that kind of loss sits in you? Wow. Well, there are very many different kinds of loss. There is professional loss. And if you're especially good at what you do in the way that the world will miss it, that creates an even greater tragedy to not being able to be what you are professionally. There's the loss of a suffering-free life, a life without a lot of turbulent, violent physical suffering. There's relationship loss. Your marriage might break up. You might not see your close ones. There's loss of having children if you're of the kind of age where your illness is going to make you miss that opportunity, and that can be especially painful for women. There's longevity loss, right? These illnesses cut down the length of your life. There's a kind of loss at the level of justice in the sense that there is no more justice-wise disempowered group in the West than people with extreme acute chronic illnesses like ME and long COVID, because there's a strong combination here of the extremity of these illnesses. They are more severe than any major illnesses on Earth, except terminal illness is a short time out from death. And at the same time, they're completely ignored to the point that you almost might as well be in the 1500s, right? And it's unheard of for other kinds of health conditions. You're on the wrong end of a kind of societal taboo. Society doesn't even have the language to capture not even what's happening to you, but the fact that it's as bad as it is. There's a kind of loss of medical support, even if you have medical support, in the sense that if you have a conventional health condition, your doctor will carry it for you. You can outsource the holding of it to the doctor because they'll say, okay, these are the odds of that happening, these are the odds of this happening. So these are the decisions we should lean toward making. In the realm of acute chronic illness, it's let's look at what we might do together. So you're holding the existential weight of consequential medical decisions in a way that patients with other illnesses don't. I mean, there can be secondary effects on mental health, right? You've got a physical illness that then leads to mental health problems, either biologically, because the illness corrupts your brain chemistry, or psychologically, because it's so difficult to be so ill and, as it were, so ignored and misunderstood. There's loss for others. There's loss for your carers. There's loss for your families, loss for the people who love you. There's financial loss. These illnesses are devastating financially. I'm not in a good way financially because of how ill I am. And what happened to me a year and a half ago cost minimally tens upon tens of thousands to get me through. There's all kinds of smaller loss, sexual loss. Most of these people either don't have or don't have much of a sex life. There's gastronomic loss. A lot of these people can't eat most foods. There's loss of travel, loss of spontaneity, which is very important because you're most yourself when you're spontaneous. But if you're weighed down by symptoms, you can't be spontaneous. There can be neurodiversity loss if you've got ADHD and autism, then these chronic illnesses will make these worse. In my case, there is YouTube loss, you know. Um, Jake Bro was telling me the other day, you know, Vlad, I work alone, but I work harder than most humans could manage, right? And I do YouTube on an hour or two a day. So YouTube loss, beautiful community. There we go, YouTube loss. So this is going to be quite individual, I think, for a lot of people, but there's a lot of loss, and it's very important to acknowledge it rather than run away from it and be in denial of it. El Gran Pedrito, what you achieve in such a state is incredible. It inspires me. Thank you very much. Ross, do you know people in the ME long COVID community who've fallen for supposed miracle cures? No. That can happen more with other health conditions. What happens when you get ME and long COVID, because these are conditions that are so ignored, you tend to educate yourself very well on what's out there. That means you can gamble on something, but you're making some knowledgeable gambles if they're gambles. So basically, ME and long COVID patients, unless they're very early in the process, don't tend to go for miracle cures. Echelon. Any tips what to do when the mind is making, this is a mental health question, so we're going to change lanes a little bit. Any tips for what to do when the mind is making the body thoroughly sick? I've been dealing with persistent somatic symptoms for many years. Some aspects are manageable through meds and therapy, most aren't. My lifelong mental illness has progressed up to the point where it's really challenging. I'd love to know what you'd suggest if the mind's the core of the illness. And of course, to clarify, there's so many things I've tried and I've done therapy and drug regimens. So I don't have the same expertise, right, on mental health as I do on physical health. Now, obviously, one keeps trying to dig for the root of the problem very sharply, being aware of the distinctions between a mental health problem, a neurological problem, and a whole body biological problem. Most people don't have clarity about where they are. There's a lot of people walking around thinking they've got a mental health problem, and in fact, they don't. There's something upstream that's causing it. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that's the case with you. I don't know what's going on with you, but getting clarity about what's wrong such that you don't tackle neurological things psychologically or whole body things just neurologically and so on. So that's very important. Then on the mental health side, it's really better to ask somebody with much more experience than me of this sort of thing. But of course, here we're talking about proximity to things you love, finding things you love, finding things you enjoy, and making time with them. Identifying things that you find very, very difficult and creating buffers so that you're not overwhelmingly and suddenly and unexpectedly exposed to all the things you find difficult. Getting as many people in your life to understand exactly what's wrong and what is most challenging on a day-to-day basis so that they can provide some kind of a network of support. Knowing when to think about the future and when to just get through the day. Being open to the possibility that more pleasure, more enjoyment might be possible under these difficult circumstances than seems to be the case. Giving yourself credit for how much you are successfully managing to just survive through this, and so on and so forth. Ralph, love you, and there's no one I respect as much as I respect you. Thanks for your work. Thank you so much. How, Moose? Hey, Vlad, how is it possible to help those close to us who might struggle or resist accepting our illness and fluctuating disability? I'd go in opposite directions here. I'd go to the source and then I'd go to the practical approach. It's very important that the source of this is not misinformation or ignorance. That's downstream of the source. The source is fear. And there are two kinds of phobias that chronic illness, especially acute chronic illness, invokes in healthy humans. One is fear of death, the other is fear of the unknown. Interestingly, these are also the two fears that are together evoked in our experience of finding something ugly. That's very interesting, right? So understand how terribly frightened most people are. Most people are really, 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 really frightened. They need to immediately normalize your illness so it doesn't seem as bad as it is. Or they need to look away and change the subject from it, or they need to get angry about it, and so on. So understand that these two kinds of phobias are extremely powerful, and that people are generally very, 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 very frightened. And that fear usually leads to a response that seems sociopathic, right? To the point that even a lot of the well-wishing you're going to hear is going to be sociopathic. Now, I'm going to make a video, I hope soon, on the Vlad's Me Diary channel about what to say and what not to say to people with chronic illness in your private life. This does not apply to how you speak to me. You need to understand that whatever positive stuff you say to me about my illness is amazing, and I'm delighted to hear it. So I don't need you to change anything in the way you speak about me. But having made this qualification, I'm just going to make a point to answer the question here. Notice a lot of the positive comments I get about my health. They are stay healthy and hope you're well. Right? So think about the fact that this is a combination of loving positivity and fearful sociopathy, in the sense that you don't tell somebody who's got an elephant standing on them, hope you're well, stay well, right? So people are incredibly, incredibly frightened. So one thing to do is just to understand how terribly frightened people are and to be compassionate about that fear. They're very, 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 you're very ill, they're very frightened. You've both got issues. You'd rather be very frightened than very ill, but being very frightened is not nice. And then there is another side to it, which is the more practical side. And the more practical side is if you're well enough, and if you're not outsourced this to somebody, prepare a package presentation, ready-made package presentation for people who are new to your illness in your life, or who are not new but need to be properly introduced. So, for instance, before I got long COVID, I had a small presentation pack that people who loved me very much could consume in just 2 or 3 hours as a one-off. That involved a lecture by a Harvard professor of medicine. It involved a summary of my own medical test results and medical letters, and a summary of my symptoms, and a little bit on the politics and sociology of the avoidance of this illness, and the ignoring of this illness by medical systems and by political systems. Boom, 3 hours, you're online. So both, right? There's an educational component and a psychological component that grasps where this is coming from. Matteo, Vlad deals with woes with such class and humility. This is great. Thank you so much. Daphne, 2 questions. Um, you must be such a delicious friend to yourself. Do you keep a diary? Do you do all your work in your mind? How are you so organized with your health issues? So, I mean, I think these are different questions, right? I'm not very organized with my health issues at all. Up until 2 or 3 months ago, since I got my post-COVID microvascular damage a year and a half ago, my partner has been taking care of all of my medical appointments, even making notes and attending them with me virtually. Even when she wasn't in the same space, she'd zoom in. Because things got so big for her at work recently, she couldn't do that. So I've had to hold the ball in the last 3 months, and I've dropped it because I've got so many medical things going on and I can't keep up. And that takes us back to this point about needing to carry your own medical process. Because when I speak to the leading experts in the world in with my condition, they're not going to tell me what to do. Between us, we're going to make decisions that have risks and consequences, risks and benefits. So I'm holding all of this myself, and very often it's me together with my doctors, but essentially me who makes the final decision on the medication. Whereas if you have something else, like I have a separate heart condition, it's not fully separate, it's a connective tissue issue, but I have a heart condition, um, a, dilatation of the aortic root, which needs to be regularly checked. And that's completely in the hands of my cardiologist. She carries it for me. But then with my other cardiologist, my microvascular cardiologist, they don't carry it. We carry it together with me, then making the final call. So this is hard, and I'm dropping the ball on it all the time. In terms of mental health and mental resilience, I would separate these two things out. So being mentally resilient is very different to being mentally healthy. Being mentally resilient is being punched in the face by big stuff and then being ready to get up. Mental health is different. It's much less of a rigid thing. It's being able to dance, being open to new possibilities, and feeling ultimately that joy and suffering are equally part of life, just they are unevenly distributed between us. So I do my best with this. I'm very lucky that I have certain strong foundations like good mental health and strong confidence and a strong sense of who I am. And I love being in my mind. My mind is also a bit dysregulated because of my physical illness, but fundamentally, I love being in my mind. It's incredible being me. So then I would say one difficult thing is when you're very ill, you've got very little time. And very often looking after your mental health needs a little bit of free time and spontaneity. And there's a paradox, a kind of catch-22 where you need the time for this, but you fundamentally don't have it. You're like a busy CEO, especially if, like me, you work a little bit part-time as I do from bed. Andy, and that we would have cleared then the questions left in advance. We had a tiny group today because we're talking health, and so there's going to be an opportunity for us to take pretty much the majority of the questions. Do you think your approach or attitude toward your immune long COVID would be different if the symptoms were brought on all at once by a single event? No. And they are often for many patients, right? Symptoms come on gradually for some over the course of some weeks or months. For others, they're there within a matter of a couple of weeks. Um, so it can be very much like a car accident in the rapidity of it. Maybe I'm missing something that you have in mind. Let me know if I am. All right. Let's see where we are. Dana the Hill, where should I go in London? If I'm semi-functional, go to public spaces where you can lie down or sit down easily, like the South Bank Centre. I don't know if you're into the arts. London is very, very powerful when it comes to the visual arts and to music and for music. So, but this completely depends on what you can do. If you can eat, then obviously I could recommend you some restaurants if you can eat anything at all, if you're on a strict diet. Sorry, I can't be more elaborate because there's too much to recommend abstractly until I know more. You can drop me an email and I can try to get back. Matteo, thank you. All right. What are your top pieces of advice for caregivers, Robert, who look after those who are deeply sick in regard to taking proper care of themselves? Understand that love is not enough. That A, you can't run yourself into the ground physically and mentally because something might break in you. And if it breaks in you, it might be very difficult to recover. It might be very difficult to get back on the horse. Number one. Number two, try as much as is feasible in your life to understand that this is a team effort and you need to get more people on board. This has to be a village enterprise. Three, have really good boundaries with the ill person. If they're well enough to communicate and to eat. If you're not doing caring for somebody who's essentially lying silently, tube fed in a dark room, that's different. If they can communicate, you've got to have boundaries with them. They can't just moan about their health 24/7 every day, right? So it might be that weekends is when we debrief about how your health is going, right? You can't come back from a busy day at work and every day face a 45-minute debrief about how they are overwhelmed by everything terrible happening to their health, because you'll sink. So boundaries, funnily enough, and it is okay to ask things from the sick person. It creates very difficult, stressful dynamics of reciprocity, right? Acknowledge and be open and dialogical about the injustices introduced into the relationship. If this is your partner, you might not be able to go on holiday together. You might not be able to watch a long movie together, even. You might not be able to make love together. How do you deal with that, right? It introduces structural injustice into the relationship. I mean, this list can go on, but this is enough to get going with. Understand also, finally, that in some emotional ways, the illness can be harder for carers than for the people who are ill. Kozumok, hey Vlad, I discovered you last week. Want to wish your health well and wish you to recover. Um, Thank you so much for discovering me, and what a blessing to keep running into people on the chat channel and on the main channel, where a new video is out yesterday. Beautiful community, so make sure you catch it. By the way, Kozumok, I would never make this correction in another chat. It's only because we're so pedantic in the nitty gritty of chronic illness. You don't wish somebody like me to recover, because statistically, it's very unlikely, right? And so you're basically saying something that's not true to the person's situation, right? So to take my situation seriously, you'd wish me to have better health rather than to recover, right? But I mean, I would never correct you in another forum. It's just because we're getting nitty gritty into the health stuff in this chat. Alex, is anger, resentment something that you or others in similar situations feel? Yes. If yes, how do you process it, knowing that these problems are likely permanent and no one's fault in particular? Well, they are politically somebody's fault, right? Because there's a gross injustice happening about these groups simply being ignored. It's like, how many people can we disappear from society and still get on as though nothing has happened? That aside, I am slow personally to feel anger. There was one type of very trivial anger that I felt when I lost my ability to stand a year and a half ago. And so far, it looks like I stopped feeling it in the last few months. And that was a very trivial anger about obstacles. I got angry about obstacles in my way. I didn't mean I completely lost the plot, but it meant I lost the plot a little bit on some occasions. So when things were in my way. And for the first year, I would literally say things like, I can't believe this is in my way, or it's disgraceful that this is in my way. And obviously, then I would, if I had the health, giggle at that just 30 seconds later. And if I said that to my partner, I'd apologize. Once we were making a rare trip out. It was my first trip out since being in hospital a few months later. And this was a very special, short 15-minute trip to a musical event, which we didn't even know I was going to physically survive, but I did. It was wonderful. And I had an air purifier in the way as I was rolling out of the home. And I said that it is abusive for there to be an air purifier in my way. And where that was coming from, and I apologized immediately. And where that was coming from was just my struggle to accept that I'd lost the ability to stand, A, and B, lost it in such a violent way. Because it's not that I can't stand, it's that if I move towards standing, my body does something so violent that makes me suffocate for 2 or 3 days. And potentially could be even worse than that. So it's that extraordinarily violent border, right? And I've completely lost that in the last few months. I no longer feel angry about obstacles in my way. People act like there is a silver lining to everything. Well, you could say there's a kind of silver lining in the sense that there's always going to be something enriching about a very terrible experience. The problem is that there's more terribleness about it than enrichingness about it. So it's not that you say there is nothing good about it. It's that you say that it is overwhelmingly bad, right? How do you embrace the fear of a death? I am 36, not ill, and I acknowledge in theory the inevitability of it. However, leaning back and just living life in the present is difficult. So the biggest way it affects an ill person is that I'm likely to get to the end of my life, certain to get to the end of my life, without having made the contribution that I would have made if I were well. And to be able to have an adequate relationship with death in a society needs to have a culture whereby people have said, I've had a wonderful life now, if you were lucky, and therefore now it's good timing, right? I'm ready and it'll be appropriate now. That is unavailable to an ill person. Um, i- if I am going to think about me being at that point, um, my contribution inevitably will be broken and very uneven and incomplete. Right now, I'm making more of a public contribution and less of a contribution to actually doing academic philosophical work, which feels like a terrible loss. I feel like a musician without their instrument with that. So that's the very big deal. You're going to have to deal with it without having had the chance to make the kind of contribution. Now, a healthy person could try to make their contribution and fail, but there's a difference there because one is an intrinsic failure. You had the chance to give it a go and it didn't work. You tried to be a painter, but turned out you were rubbish at painting. And so there we go. But the ill person never gets the chance to try. And so as Nietzsche said, for every Raphael, there are several Raphaels born without hands. And that absolutely changes your capacity to accept um, mortality. After being sick, I often look for clues and signs from the universe. For example, Manchester United's form often mirrors my condition. Is this harmless escapism or is it a bad idea? I'd politely ask if you've got autism or OCD, given your question. Think about that, because if that is the case, then that could be interesting and helpful to know. Beyond that, um, fear can make people superstitious, but in the end, I don't believe in synchronicity in the world the way Jung did. Genuine question: could you stand if you were put in a swimming pool right now? No, I couldn't. Thanks, David, for asking. Deep, deep empathy to everybody here who's struggling a lot with different things, physical, mental, life conditions. Jan says, I often say something along the lines of, hope you're doing all right despite the circumstances. Well, let me be absolutely honest to almost go back on what I said earlier. When some of you guys tell me, and actually it might not be you guys because we're such a small group today that you probably all know what to say. But when people say, Vlad, so glad you're well, I like it. I take that really well. I don't sit around thinking, oh my God, right? I'm not well, am I? And so are they gaslighting me? No, it's positive. And we don't have enough positivity on the internet. And one of my commitments is, for all of the pessimism of my critique of our circumstances politically, is to be a source of a kind of optimism, or at least a kind of pessimism of strength on the internet when people are overwhelmed by um, negativity slop. And that works actually, right? A lot of you lean both on my confidence and on my groundedness and on my hopefulness. It's quite funny, isn't it? Because when I tell you, oh, your democracies are in decline, but actually a lot of you are still leaning on that quite well. And by leaning, I mean taking something from our interactions that then allows you to self-generate something rather than borrowing something from myself directly. You're making something for yourself on the basis of our exchange. John, hey Vlad, I'm 24. I started watching you when I was 20, and I remained unsubscribed for 2 years, but watched every video and didn't really understand what you spoke of then, but can say you've changed my life. Thank you for being with me, and life is utterly extraordinary. There's so many things to take pleasure in and explore. It's unbelievable. 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 Do you believe in God, the universe, karma? I have the greatest respect for religious experience, particularly when it's in embedded traditions. But I'm not religious myself. I do not believe in God. Jan, feel free to ignore this question, or Janor, or I can't quite know where the first name stops when I read you guys. Feel free to ignore this question. I know it's not appropriate and might even feel disrespectful, but are you healthy enough to be intimate with your wife in any way? Cuddling sessions, at least. Definitely, yes. Um, and then in terms of a sex life, it's something I haven't lost, but it's something that is below 5% relative to what it would be if I were healthy. With acute issues like long COVID, do you have distinct, delayed, multi day post exertional malaise? So, post exertional malaise is not a symptom, it's a systemic and delayed deterioration of all symptoms that is, in fact, a distinctive feature of ME and some, but not all, long COVID. If yes, how often and how do you manage it on top of everything else? All the time, right? I'm going to crash just from this live. However, my microvascular issues are more extreme than my post exertional malaise. Having said this, what has been happening more recently is a little bit more of a merger between my microvascular issues and my ME symptoms, such that verticalization now is not just catastrophic for the long COVID microvascular symptoms that are all in my chest and back, and they cause me to suffocate. But they also create this uh, multi-symptom bodily response now. So there's a bit of a merger between my ME and long COVID, whereby verticalization can create PM. But having said this, the chief obstacle I'm facing is all back and chest. It's all the microvascular damage there. And that means that at the moment, PM is a big part of my life, but it's not the biggest part of my life. Do you think everything is predestined? Absolutely not. Free will or a combination of something else? I've made a video on free will on the philosophy channel. Check it out if you want. How free is our will? Our will is as free as it needs to be. Why doesn't this illness get the research and development it needs? There are basically two reasons. One is a kind of default reason, namely, it's very difficult to bring a new condition on board when all the energy and all the funding is already distributed among all the other conditions that have very effective lobbies and are very effectively organized. But that's not the biggest reason. The biggest reason is that there was a systematic campaign to disappear this illness, similar to the campaign of climate denial by the fossil fuel industry in the 1980s. Just like there was that kind of campaign, so there was a very systematic campaign to disappear these illnesses and make it out that they were uh, psychiatric illnesses or psychosocial illnesses. By the way, there is no such thing in my assessment as a psychosocial illness. That's an erroneous dead end of conceptual misdeeds in professional psychiatry. Now, this was always wrong. This was wrong in the 1950s because clinically you can see these people are physically sick. They don't have a mental problem. But we didn't have proof that this was a physically based condition until about the early 1990s. But even as that proof began to appear, the attempt to keep this illness disappeared remained. And it was a determinate enterprise and a kind of a research project. And that research project is and has been in perpetual retreat, but it's reluctant to take each of the steps of retreat that it is forced to by scientific reality. So this is very difficult because unfortunately you can't explain why these illnesses disappeared without sounding like a conspiracy theorist who doesn't actually know the history, because there's a very, very, very ugly history there. I won't go into it further for today's purposes, but these are the two stories. What you lack in health, you gained in a broader sense of knowledge and reason, almost like a handicapped superhero, best wishes. No, I read less by about 90% than I would if I were well. I think less by about 90% than I would if I were well. My indulgence and enjoyment of knowledge and reason is extraordinarily magical, but much reduced relative to my healthy self. What about caring for a loved one with dementia? Paul is asking. Not my expertise. It raises many of the things we talked about when we talked about carers earlier, but it also raises deep questions about love and identity, obviously, and the relations of identity to mental continuity versus bodily continuity. Do you think emotional states can amplify or cause some chronic illnesses? The degree to which we think that they can cause chronic illnesses is dramatically overestimated. And as by chronic illness, you just think of something relatively moderate. You can't really think your way into very systemic illness, basically. So we tend to overestimate that. How important is emotional regulation to any illness? God, huge, right? Imagine, you know, going on a very difficult journey with any of 10 illnesses you can name. And on one end, you're going to go with a very dysregulated and awful emotional life, in another, a much nicer emotional life. Of course, it's going to be physically beneficial to go with the latter. Having said this, then there's also something else that very often, because your brain is a physical thing, it is messed around by your illness, and it makes emotional regulation very difficult. So it's enormously important, and I take it enormously seriously. I'm not somebody who sort of undermines this aspect. I mean, I'm a guy who's meditated twice a day since 2004, right? So having said this, can you get into a chronic illness very easily with significant stress. I mean, not without deep genetic predisposition to it, I suppose, and even then it's going to be hard just to get there through stress. Jan, 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 I have fallen ill with ME last year myself. I'm deeply sorry. I try to be hopeful that research is picking up, that we might see treatments in the future. Do you share this hope? There is no prospect of treatments within the next decade, realistically. I'm afraid that's where it's at. I mean, I know personally some of the leading researchers. I mean, one of the leading people in the history of ME, Professor Nancy Klimas, has been my doctor for 15 years, and she's at the cutting edge of research. But she is utterly amazing, but overwhelmed and, working with very, very limited funding in her research. So just numerically, there's some extraordinary people working on this, but too few, just not enough money. The reverse of this is that you could fix this very rapidly. I mean, if Trump didn't do the Iran war and put all of that money into these illnesses, within 5 years you could be well. And we're talking about tens of millions of people across the globe. Their lives could be moved from disaster to a splendid state if that sum of money was put into them. Even less than that, even 10 billion well spent could take us a long way toward fixing this. So just one small war less, and we can probably do a lot to clear much of the acute chronic illness community out of their nightmare. What do you think about polyamory? It's a question for another time. I'll just say a word on it. We're in a crisis where people have their identities that dissolve, and people are role playing without having a sense of identity. Of course, we're going to have an outbreak of polyamory in this culture. I'll say more about it. Do you have negative feelings about being people who are well being too ungrateful for their good health? Defixus is asking. Great question. I don't at all, but I did really early on in my illness, which was doubly unfair. So I remember when I was doing my PhD, like 1/8 time, not even part-time, I was thinking, because most PhD students are having a bit of a breakdown. I mean, oh my God, do I really have anything original to say? How am I ever going to finish this thing? Am I a fraud? And I thought, in some moods, when I was much, much younger, 20 years ago, come on. If I were well, gun to my head, I could do a PhD in 6 months. Please. Stop crying in year 4 about how the next paragraph isn't just coming out and maybe you're not who you thought you were as a result. And I completely let that go. Because what we need to understand is that what is easy for somebody is difficult for somebody else, and what is easy for somebody else can be difficult for you, right? Number one. And number two, you can't relativize, because somebody else can come along and say, well, there's always somebody in a much worse predicament, right? So I don't believe in relativization. So now my response is totally different, and I just don't relativize. So if you come to me and you say, oh my God, my nail snapped away because my pinky got stuck in the door, I will say, oh my God, what a dreadful day. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I'll mean it. I really will have no thoughts like, well, imagine if, an elephant stood on you. So I don't relativize at all now. I mean, Obviously, I do relativize, but I don't relativize in that neurotic pathological sense where, oh, yeah, you got it easy. No, you don't. And most people are struggling. Most people are having a difficult time, right? And then also something else. I mean, most of my experience daily is terrible, right? 94% of any day of mine is terrible. But the 6% of my day when I'm more functional is amazing, right? It's incredible being inside my head. Um, so I am in that 6% happier than virtually any human being I know. So there are different kinds of comparisons one could make. Do you think the next years with AI will come up with real treatments? No, because AI won't just in of itself do it. It needs to be properly deployed, which itself takes research. It can speed certain things up, but I wouldn't have this kind of generic hope, oh, AI in 5 years will fix this. Even though I do think with money and effort it's fixable. Um, Currently, Farmer is not convinced that there's a massive financial upside. If there were a biomarker, then I think that pharma would be much more interested. So, what's the difference between a lot of biological markers and a kind of a pathogenesis based biomarker? So, if you look at a person with immune long COVID, not on the simple blood test you do at your GP, which might be completely normal, but you do comprehensive testing on them, they're going to look terrifyingly ill on paper, right? If you hear nothing from an ME patient, they can be recognized on paper easily. For a long time now, that's been possible on sophisticated testing, right? So these people test like they're really ill on the most sophisticated tests. But that is a combination of tests put together that reveals a complex picture. What we don't have is a single yes or no binary test that tells somebody if they've got ME or long COVID. So having that would be very, very helpful. I know a lot of illnesses that do get a lot of investment and research don't have that, but that would be very helpful. But we don't have that, even though what we do have is, of course, a very intricate biological picture, such that if you showed me a folder of tests of people who are healthy, a folder of tests of people who have other illnesses, and a folder of tests with people who've got ME, I'd recognize the ME group and they're just on paper without anybody telling me what their symptoms are. Don't know what you mean, Astro Gremlin, with your comment about transition. Let's see where we are. Okay. John, hey Vlad, sorry to be vulgar. What do you think of sex surrogacy for disabled and neurodivergent affected people? I saw a woman recently doing this. Well, women often go into partial remission with their me when they get pregnant and relapse after pregnancy. Remission is too strong a word, but it can make the symptoms less bad. Um, these are very, 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 very big questions, right? So um, you you can have a baby and you might not be well enough to look after it, so a village might need to be looked after it, or you want to look after it but you can't carry it, so somebody else needs to create it for you, and so on. Um, there's no right answers here. These are very, very difficult questions that are always going to be answered individually by the aspiring mum, together with her partner. Gaffer Bob Vlad, great gift to us showing that physical limitations can't prevent one from leading a full productive life. Um, so I'm going to just do this kind of double-mindedness here. What a beautiful comment, and I would be in love with the comment in any other forum. Here, because we're doing the chronic health deep dive, I'm just going to nitpick. Full productive life? You see what I mean? I just said 94% of the day has disappeared for me, and you say full productive life? You see, we're back to that conversation about fear uh, uh, of chronic illness, right? And needing to brush it under the carpet. Um, I love your comment. I wouldn't pick on it in another context. It's just because we're geeking out on that today. But do know that any kind of positive comment about my health, even if it is, Vlad, I'm so glad you feel well all the time, I love. How would you experience your illness if you were in Ukraine and Russia? So the stats are the same for folks there. It's just much worse there. In Ukraine, there's going to be, and in Russia, there's going to be much more prejudice, much more ignorance, and much, much less support. Even if you say, Vlad, what are you talking about? There's no support on the UK NHS for these illnesses. There's just gaslighting, effectively. Because there's either no support or there are very few support clinics around the country that systematically fail to understand the conditions they try to offer you support with. So it's a disaster. Um, but can it be worse? Yeah, it can. And Ukraine is and Russia are countries where it is worse. So it'll just be worse. And you'll have fewer protections. Just a few months ago, I was aware of a Ukrainian young man with ME who was forcibly institutionalized because they claimed that he had a mental health condition, which he didn't have. So, yeah, the last thing you want, and don't imagine that these numbers are small, but the last thing you want, if you're ill like me, for example, I'm dependent on oxygen for a part of the day, is Russian bombs falling on your head. Right. This is an utter and total nightmare for chronically ill people in Ukraine, what's happening right now. And don't think it's a few. Yes, a lot left, but a lot also didn't leave. So the chronically ill people who are still in Ukraine, this is a nightmare for them. Because they're much more dependent on everything else going smoothly during their day, because their illness doesn't go smoothly, and they're very dependent on electricity, very dependent on elevators working if they're well enough to get out of the house. So war is a kind of a force multiplier for the nightmarishness of chronic illness. So it's a terrible double whammy for people in Ukraine. An absolutely terrible double whammy. People with long COVID and ME in Ukraine are not having a good time. And of course, the COVID problem was exacerbated by all of the shelters where people were in close proximity, getting giving back and forth to each other earlier on in the war, especially, but still now too. So it's just a magnifier. So you take a chronically ill person, you put them in a mild war zone, mild to moderate war zone. What a disaster, right? I mean, imagine also being chronically ill in Gaza. It's unbelievable, unbelievable. NIH is being gutted. Yeah. So the Trump administration is doing the sorts of things that mean that illnesses like these are not going to get the proper research they need. Um, Somebody is saying Ukraine and Russia have decent healthcare systems. Unless he's being directly bombed, he'll probably deal with it. No, they don't. I mean, that the health systems are pretty bad, and they're cataclysmically catastrophic for chronic illness. So no, they wouldn't deal with it. Sorry to be mean, but I just needed to be clear about that. Do disabilities ever help with the development of artists? Was somebody like Beethoven helped by his deafness? Ethan. Wow. Generally, no, but it depends on the kind of disability. So let's take one example, which is Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a condition that caused the degeneration of his small vessels. And that was, in my opinion, possibly or probably Codicil. Now, it's possible with Codicil that it can somehow mess around with your brain, that it can make you a little bit more um, effective at certain tasks while dramatically limiting you in other ways. Um, so Nietzsche felt that his illness may have done something for his imagination, but he was also knocked out by it a lot and had to adapt his writing. He wrote aphoristically partly because he was ill. He thought that on balance, his illness was worth it, that his illness on balance helped him be a better philosopher. I think that I don't believe him. And all you need to do to not be so rapid in believing Nietzsche is just read his diaries and how desperate he is about all the troubles he's having with his health. He's desperate with all of his troubles with his health. He's so frustrated. He's feeling like he's not getting enough oxygen in his brain. He's so frustrated by his overwhelming headaches. He's so frustrated by, such long stretches of complete incapacity. So Nietzsche said it. Nietzsche wanted to believe it. I don't quite believe him. Did Beethoven get helped by his illness? No. By his deafness? I would say probably not, because you have to understand the extraordinary nature of Beethoven's talent. Beethoven's talent is so extraordinary that he wouldn't have got complacent about its development if he were healthy, you see. It was just too ferocious a talent to not keep on developing. What I think non-musicians can fail to understand is that going deaf is not as big a disaster for composer as it might seem. It's a disaster, but it's not as big a disaster as some musical amateurs might think it to be. You once mentioned that you had two major problems, two major criticisms of the biopsychosocial model. The one regarding its application resonated with my experience, but could you elaborate more on the philosophical point? I might discuss it at length at some point. For now, I'm going to direct you to the thoughts of Diane O'Leary, who is a philosopher who has dealt with chronic illness and ex- and extreme illness and has spoken about it with a good deal of conceptual clarity. But essentially, the biopsychosocial model is so bad that I don't find it interesting to even discuss it intellectually. Um, I find it preferable to discuss it sociologically. What it was in the 1970s a very lame attempt by psychiatry to do philosophy. And in the process, they completely misunderstood the basic philosophical problems they were importing into its discipline. They made elementary mistakes that you wouldn't even have an undergraduate make. And that served as a foundation for many of the research projects in psychiatry, which is just a complete professional embarrassment, of course. Doesn't rule out psychiatry as a valid profession, as a very important and useful profession, but it rules out these particular research projects within it. Um, and so basically, it was an elementary mistake of philosophical debates about dualism that created this problem and created this bizarre biopsychosocial concoction that is completely conceptually unsustainable. I won't argue for that now. I'll probably do a separate video about it. If you want some of the arguments that I think are very good to make, Diane O'Leary makes them very well. Politically, what steps need to happen so that a couple of $1 billion get routed to ME research? Well, getting a lot of politicians on board is important. Um, reforming health systems is important. And having some very, 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 very wealthy billionaires have very direct contact with this illness is also very important. Vlad, what's your explanation, Richard Oldfields, for why your health declined so dramatically as you stand up? So, um, up to a point, this has to be a placeholder, but it's connected to the microvascular damage. And so, as one of the leading specialists says, I experience an oxygen offloading crisis to my cells and tissues when I verticalize. How did you avoid building up a hero's journey narrative where you'd return to perfect health? I struggled with an injury and the loss of what I was. So, only in the first year of or two of my illness, when I was a young boy, age 22, 23, I did go on sort of thinking that every day I'd wake up the next day well. And that was a bit of masculine immaturity. Okay. It's very nice to have a small group. I'm basically taking all the health questions. Person of interest. Thank you, Vlad. Loving embrace from a very old lady in South Africa. Poor eyesight stops me from commenting sometimes, but I always enjoy listening to you. What a delight it is for you, for me, to have you with me. Would the late quartets exist without Beethoven's deafness? Um, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Beethoven's creativity would be unobstructed by good health. No, in the sense that if you change one very big thing in the composer's life, it's going to impact everything in their lives. And so the quartets could be a bit different. Um, but I wouldn't overstate that case. That's how I'd balance that one, Lou. Dog poop. Do you think scientism is the result of the failure of our education system to teach philosophy and humanities alongside the natural sciences? Well, the problem is that a lot of the urge for scientism is coming from within philosophy and humanities. So we can't blame science for scientism. We really have to blame the culture for scientism. In fact, scientism is an affront to science. Instead of saying, isn't science utterly extraordinary? It says, oh, let's just stick science into every hole we can find to see if it helps. I'll say something about scientism and illness, though, which I haven't said that much in public before. One of the things that scientism encourages is a mistaken idea about the relation of physical symptoms and their expression. The correct approach is to think of symptoms. Well, of course, symptoms can be faked in principle, but the correct approach is to think of symptoms and their expression as being two things that are very naturally linked. An approach that is scientistic here is an approach that unfortunately become dominant in contemporary medicine, and that says um, the expression of symptoms teaches us nothing about the symptoms until we verify this. So, um, in other words, this is the view that the expression of symptoms leaves what these symptoms actually are like mysterious. There's a kind of a disconnect there, whereby, yes, you see the expression, but you still don't know what somebody's pain is like. You still don't know what somebody else's feeling of some nasty symptom is like. And I want to say, no, you do. From the way somebody expresses a symptom, it is a natural part of our capacity to understand that we do begin to grasp what it's actually like for the other person. And contemporary medicine tends to want to see this as much more mysterious because the only things we believe are the verifiable data stuff. That's not to say that's not central and important. It's rather to say that um, there is a difference between it being important and it breaking down a very basic way in which humans effectively communicate about their experience of pain and other symptoms. Right. So Wittgenstein would say there's a very natural relation between symptoms and their expression. Modern medicine says no, there isn't. There's in fact potentially a very wide, mysterious gap, such that from the surface we can't learn much about what's inside. I'm saying that's bullshit. I'm saying that um, the interiority of illness is actually intelligible through and through, and what's more, often readily intelligible. And that's a prejudice that has actually contributed to uh, us ignoring chronic illness, right? When a lot of women with ME in the 1980s went to their doctors and said, "Look, I'm so ill, I'm so ill." The doctor said, "Well, so far on the tests we can do, we can't see anything wrong with you. So maybe you're being hysterical, no matter how seriously you're reporting your symptoms." In a culture where there's a less um, unhealthily rigid rejection of this natural link between the expression of symptoms and their interior experience, such prejudice would be less likely. That's not to say that we don't need the verifiable data. Of course, that's the essence of medicine. We need it. So that's not the point. The point is rather that the importance of verifiable data shouldn't lead you to deny the natural link between the interiority of illness and its outward expression. All right, 15 more minutes. Only health questions, but if there aren't any, we can call it a day. Ricard. Hi, Vlad. I want to be wise about having a debilitating illness, but I find that it's very hard to know how. Do you have any good books that can help one grow into their new role in the world? I don't, in the sense that there isn't any template type solution here that you can sort of borrow from somebody who prepared it earlier for you. You need to work this out for yourself. What you do need is the capacity to dance with your illness, which means being able to relate to it as something that's not just a cessation of life, but is itself part of life, that it's something that life gives you that you didn't ask for. But it is part of life because getting things you didn't want or ask for is itself part of life. And then the question is, can you develop a kind of embodied spontaneity from the within the vantage point of having lots of terrible illness symptoms? That is incredibly hard, but you can do it up to a point. And here you want books not on illness, but on general human flourishing. So one of the books that's good about this is Marion Milner's A Life of One's Own, written in the 1930s, a couple of years after Virginia Woolf brought out A Room of One's Own. And Marion Milner comes from that tradition of psychoanalysis that speaks without any jargon and does not have a reverential attitude to psychoanalytic ritual or psychoanalytic understanding, such that there's basically no psychoanalytic concepts in this book. Just literally a woman writing about how to enjoy life and how to explore what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy. Amalfitano is making a recommendation of a book about chronic illness. Thank you so much. How did you experience your first years of illness and how did you get diagnosed back in the early 2000s? So in the UK, the ME Association had a clinical wing with two neurologists, and one neurologist, now late, diagnosed me about a year after I got sick. So I got an ME diagnosis probably about 10 months after I got sick. I knew that's what I had. So I was going there just to get the stamp, but I got the stamp. And now, of course, there isn't the funding for the ME Association to have that clinical service, which they did have 20 years ago. And back then, there were a lot of people around who wrongly and sillily told me, you'll get better in 2 or 3 years. And I was thinking, oh my God, 2 or 3 years. And somebody said, well, it could be 6 years. And I was thinking, oh God, 6 years. Can you imagine? I'm 22. I'm going to be ill till I'm 28, right? And I'm now 45 and I am more ill in some ways than I was then. And then the other thing for the first year or two of illness is that I was terribly frightened. I was terrified because the illness went to my brain. Because I said I'm better in some ways, but maybe that I'm worse now in some ways, but it that doesn't cover the maybe the first year of the illness and the brain fog I had, brain inflammation I had. I mean, I lost the ability to read almost completely for a while. And this is very common, actually. A great friend of the ME community, Jen Brer, when she got her ME first, and I recommend you watch her film from 10 years ago, Unrest, about ME. But when she got ill, she was in a restaurant and she tried to sign her name and she couldn't on the check. And I tell this story. This is the most viewed video on the Vlad's ME Diary channel of how I got sick. But I'll tell you the moment I recognized something was wrong. I was sitting in a seminar room at Nuffield College, Oxford, which is a college just for grads. And it wasn't my college. My college was Christchurch. So if anybody here knows Oxford, I was from the Christchurch Massive. And I was sitting in the room and I was making a point against a wonderful professor of philosophy, David Miller, that is generic of me to make, and the point I'd made 1,000 times in my life. And I couldn't get it out. And it just wouldn't come out. And that's never happened to me in my life. And then suddenly, a wonderful young woman called Miriam Ronzoni, who is now a political philosophy academic, looked at me, and her and I had spoken a few times already. She was doing a PhD, I think, DPhil. And she looked at me with her sort of limpid hazel eyes, didn't quite get why I got unstuck, and made my point for me. And when Miriam made it for me, I couldn't understand what she said, even though it's a point I'd been making for years. And then I looked at everybody around the room, and I looked out at the sort of grey Oxford sky, and then I realized this is not a flu. Something is neurologically wrong with me. This is a neurological disease that I've got of some kind, because this is not normal, right? There's no normal thing that could happen to me that would generate this problem. And what was funny was that I was at that point still physically well. So my brain began to go first, and my eyesight was also going. And I lost the ability to look at screens. And but I could walk. So I walked back from Nuffield to Christchurch in Oxford on this rainy day. And then I realized I need to see a neurologist because this is not normal. I no longer believe I've got some kind of virus or flu. This is something really not good. So it was almost like a stroke type experience that I had. And I immediately realized that, yeah, this is in a different category to anything that's to do with kind of being run down from having, tonsillitis or something. Lou, thank you for commending my resilience. Let me also say how proud I am of Amalfitano. Amalfitano has been on a really terrifying chronic illness journey with ME long COVID for many fewer years than me. She'd known chronic illness before, but she's been really, really ill for 3 or 4 years. And the last few months, she's been in a really difficult dip. And I'm really proud of her. She's being very resilient. and we cooperate a little bit around YouTube, although we've both been too sick um, to do much. And so send Amalfitano some good wishes because she's doing a great job, but the poor darling, she's been really, 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 really sick. Um, Victor, I could actually get in trouble with YouTube for answering your question. I'll think about it and maybe answer another time. I have complex views about this. I've already pushed it here because YouTube absolutely hates anything that is in the realm of um, mental health or unaliveness. Rachmaninov fanboy. Hi Vlad, hope you're doing well. Back to our discussions earlier. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I think we're going to call it a day. We're going to be back with normal service resumed, beautiful community, soon. But it's been nice to have a small group because I've basically taken everybody's chronic illness question, everybody's illness question, which has been really wonderful. We don't get that opportunity when we're a slightly bigger group. So thank you very, very much for being with me. We're going to be back tomorrow. One of the topics I want to cover, um, it's a bit left field, but it's actually worth talking about. We might get to it this week. Trump's relationship with Natalie Harp, because something very weird is going on there. And unfortunately, it's not just a curiosity, because it's affecting and indeed conditioning the informational environment of the most powerful person in the world. So we might talk about that. Otherwise, to all the people who are sick, I'm glad you're so well. Stay well. I'm just joking. Thank you so much for being with me. Sorry to tease people for not having the exact perfect language around how to speak to chronically ill people. If you're super geeked out on that, I'm going to make a video of how to do this well, how to speak to chronically ill people well on the Me Diary channel. All right. Thank you. Thank you, small group of folks, for hanging a little bit around. And see you soon. And of course, if you haven't, uh, big up my politics. Big up my my main channel video from yesterday. If you haven't seen it, check it out. About mobilization in Russia. Lots of love. Catch you later. Um, Alligator. And you know what? It's meant to be in a wild crocodile. And I thought for like a quarter century that it was and a wild crocodile. Very embarrassing. Lots of love. Talk very soon.